Presidential accomplishments: John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. SOL, US 1.7. John Adams was President of the United States from March 1797 to March 1801. This is a painting of John Adams by E.O. Sully. It hangs in Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is John Adams' official presidential portrait. It was painted by John Vanderlyn. It currently hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Presidential accomplishment. During John Adams' presidency, a two-party system emerged. www.history.com tells us it featured two national parties competing for control of the presidency, Congress, and the states. The first party was the Federalist Party, created largely by Alexander Hamilton. The second was the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican Party, formed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, usually called at the time the Republican Party. Note, this is a distinct party from the contemporary American political party, also known as the Republican Party. The Federalists were dominant until 1800, while the Republicans were dominant after 1800. Here is an informative video about the party system in the United States. Thomas Jefferson was President of the United States from March 1801 to March 1809. This picture is from www.encyclopediavirginia.com. This is the official White House portrait of Thomas Jefferson. It hangs in the Blue Room of the White House. It was painted by Rembrandt Peale. Presidential accomplishments. During his administration, Thomas Jefferson bought Louisiana from France. This was called the Louisiana Purchase. www.history.com tells us, for a mere $15 million, Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States, buying 800,000 square miles from the French that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Here is an informative video about the Louisiana Purchase. Presidential accomplishments. Also during the Jefferson administration, Lewis and Clark explored new land west of the Mississippi River. www.history.com tells us the Lewis and Clark expedition began in 1804 when President Thomas Jefferson tasked Meriwether Lewis with exploring lands west of the Mississippi River that comprised the Louisiana Purchase. Lewis chose William Clark as his co-leader for the mission. Here is an informative video about Lewis and Clark's expedition. James Madison. James Madison was President of the United States from March 1809 to March 1817. This is the official White House portrait painted by John Vanderlyn. It hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. This painting of James Madison is by Gilbert Stuart. It is from www.newyorker.com. Presidential accomplishment. The War of 1812 happened during James Madison's administration. The War of 1812 caused European nations to gain respect for the United States. www.britannica.com tells us, War of 1812, June 18, 1812 to February 17, 1815. Conflict fought between the United States and Great Britain over British violations of U.S. maritime rights. It ended with the exchange of ratifications of the Treaty of Ghent. Here's an informative video about the War of 1812. James Monroe. James Monroe was President of the United States from March 1817 to March 1825. This is his official White House portrait. It was painted by Chester Harding and hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. This painting of James Monroe also hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. It was painted by James Herring. Presidential accomplishment. During his administration, he introduced the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine warned European nations not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. www.britannica.com tells us, Monroe Doctrine, December 2, 1823. Cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy enunciated by President James Monroe in his annual message to Congress. Declaring that the Old World and the New World had different systems and must remain distinct spheres, Monroe made 4 basic points. 1. The United States would not interfere in the internal affairs of or the wars between European powers. 2. The United States recognized and would not interfere with existing colonies and dependencies in the Western Hemisphere. 3. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization. And 4. Any attempt by a European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. Here is a link to an informative video about the Monroe Doctrine.